Okay, so this evening's shiur is the first of a series that we are going to dedicate to the study of some of the tshuvot, some of the more creative and original responsa of Hakham Ovadiah Yosef Z, who just passed away a couple of weeks ago. He was really a titan of mastery of halakha, but also his originality and creativity, his courage to be different and to be independent in his analysis of issues, makes him stand out from among almost all contemporary poskim, both Ashkenazic and Sephardic poskim, halachic decisors of contemporary times. He stands out from among them in terms of his originality, his boldness, and his willingness to evaluate even what's already conventional wisdom, you might say, with regard to certain topics, even hot topics, where he blazes a new trail. And I thought that it might be nice to start with a unit which is easily digestible, because we're going to go through a couple of different topics, some of them more challenging than others. And this is a topic that is more manageable and digestible. We can cover it in a nice 45-minute discussion and get to the basic source and see the defining Ashkenazic position, which was Rav Moshe Feinstein Z, who passed away in 1986. And was really the premier Ashkenazic posek in America, and in some ways worldwide, but particularly in America for the 20th century, mid to late 20th century. And then Hakham Ovadiah, and how he overlapped in generations with Rav Moshe Feinstein, how he handled the same sources and the same material. So we're going to go in chronological order. Even though this can make it a little bit more of a winding path, I think it's the best path. So we're going to go in chronological order. What you see in front of you, and I apologize for those who have yellow sheets, that is just because that was what was in the copy machine unbeknownst to me. What you see in front of you is a page from the Babylonian Talmud Bavli, Masechet Kiddushin. And what we're going to look at, this is page Lamed Aleph in Masechet Kiddushin. It is from a section of the Tractate Kiddushin. Tractate Kiddushin mostly discusses weddings, marriage, contracting of a marriage, but it also segues into a discussion of mitzvot that men and women are obligated in, aren't obligated in, obligations that a father has to a son, that a son has to a father, kibud av ve'em, respecting of parents. There's a lot of side topics that come up in Masechet Kiddushin. And on the bottom here, where I made a little bracket, I hope you can find it, it's towards the bottom of the page, there's a little bracket there, and I showed you where it starts, where I'm going to read from, which is if you look at the lines, they widen as you go down the page. The widest section of lines, you'll see a little bracket, and the second of those lines, at the end of that line, it says Vav Aleph Resh Va'amar Rabbi Hanina. Okay? Now this is discussing the issue, the famous issue of who is greater, one who fulfills a mitzvah because he is obligated or she is obligated to do so, or one who fulfills a mitzvah because they feel a sense of inspiration and they voluntarily choose to fulfill the mitzvah. So va'amar Rabbi Hanina, Oma misheno mitzuveh ve'oseh, kach mitzuveh ve'oseh alachat kama v'chama. Rabbi Hanina says, if a person who fulfills the mitzvah out of the goodness of their heart receives a reward, so somebody who does it and is commanded to do so, all the more so he's going to receive a reward. This is on the end of a story, a very famous story of a non-Jew who was mechabed his father, who respected his father to such a great extent, even at a great personal sacrifice, he respected his father. So he points out here that he receives reward for that, and he's not even obligated. Ben Noach, the Noachide laws don't include respecting your parents, and yet he received a great reward, as the story told us. You can visit that story. It's a beautiful story. We're not going. It would be off our topic for tonight. But somebody who's obligated in the mitzvah, in other words, a Jew who has as one of the 613 mitzvot to respect his parents, so much more so will he be rewarded for doing so. Amar Rabbi Hanina, because Rabbi Hanina said, "Gadol mitzuveh ve'oseh mimi she'eno mitzuveh ve'oseh." Because we say one who is commanded to fulfill a mitzvah and fulfills it, is greater than one who's not commanded. We know that this is a general principle in Judaism. It's counterintuitive. People question it. Why should that be? Isn't it greater if you feel a sense of you're voluntarily doing the mitzvah? You love the mitzvah. You enjoy it. Isn't that better? So the answer is that the person who does the mitzvah out of the goodness of their heart is doing it for themselves. They're not really doing it to serve God necessarily. When you're doing it out of a sense of obligation, you're doing it to serve God, and you have to fight against your Yetzer Hara. It's one thing that you got up one morning early, you said, you know what, I'm going to go to synagogue. It's another thing that every morning you say, I need to get up because I must get up. That's a challenge. That's why it's Gadol Mitzvah Ve'oseh, that you have to overcome the internal resistance. It's not just when it feels good that you do the mitzvah. You do it whenever you're called upon to do it. So that's why it's greater. Now, why is this significant? Because of the following story, and this is how we get to our topic of bar and bat mitzvah. You're wondering, what does this have to do with bar and bat mitzvah? Well, think about it. Mitzuveh ve'oseh, right? Somebody who's commanded. What is a bar mitzvah? Or a bat mitzvah? Somebody who's obligated in doing the mitzvot. Up till that moment, they're not obligated. So, Amar Rav Yosef says, Rav Yosef, here's the background to what Rav Yosef is about to say. Rav Yosef was blind at the end of his life. He was blind. So he said, Meresh hava amina, Man dehava amar li halacha ke Rabbi Yehuda, da amar suma patur mena mitzvot, avidna yoma tava lerabanan. So he said, originally, there's an argument among the rabbis in the Talmud whether a blind person is biblically obligated in positive commandments or not. Okay? Rabbi Yehuda says a blind person is not obligated in putting on tefillin. It's only rabbinic. He doesn't have to say the Haggadah. He doesn't have to eat matzah. He doesn't have to recite the Haggadah on Pesach. He doesn't have to do any positive mitzvot, a blind person. It's only rabbinic. He's rabbinically required to do so that he can distinguish himself from a non-Jew. But he's not biblically required. So Rav Yosef said in the beginning, I said, I want someone to prove that the law follows Rabbi Yehuda. Why? And if he did, I would avidna yomat taval rabbanan. I'll make a big party for all the rabbis. What we call today a siyum masechet. Why? Right? Dehalo mifkidna veha avidna. Because then I would be exempt from all the mitzvot, but I still do them. Right? In other words, he's saying, if you could prove to me that actually I'm exempt from every mitzvah, but I do it anyway, look at that. Then I'm getting all this extra reward. That's what I originally thought. I wanted the law to be that I was exempt, according to Rabbi, that the law follows Rabbi Yehuda. However, now hashtad shma'ita lahada amar Rabbi Hanina gadol mitzuvah ve'oseh yoter mimisheno mitzuvah ve'oseh. So he said, but then I heard what Rabbi Hanina said, that no, it's the opposite. Somebody who's obligated is greater than somebody who does it out of the goodness of their heart. Now I want to be obligated. I want to be obligated so I can get the greater reward. So what do? So he says, now I said, anybody, adirabba, on the contrary, manda amarli de'en halacha ke Rabbi Yehuda. Anybody who can prove to me that we reject the teaching of Rabbi Yehuda, we obligate the blind in the same commandments as the people with sight, that person, avidne yomat aval rabbanan, then I'll make a party. Okay, so what do you see from this though? You see that he wants to get the most reward. Okay, whoever can prove to him that he's getting more reward, he wants to. He wants to make a party. That's the most important thing. He's looking for a reason. So what happens? So in other words, when he thought that doing it voluntarily was better, he wanted that to be the halakha, so he could say he was doing it voluntarily. Now that he knows that no, being obligated is greater. So then I want blind people to be obligated. So I can be obligated and fulfill the mitzvot out of obligation and get a greater reward. But what do you see from here? You see from here a couple of things. That actually there's a couple of halachot that are drawn from this piece, but we won't go into them today, maybe another time. But one of the key things that's derived from here by some of the later commentaries on the Talmud is the idea of a bar mitzvah. Because what do you see? It's a simcha for a person to be obligated in the mitzvot. Because Rav Yosef said, if I find out that I'm obligated in the mitzvot, now when I do a mitzvah, I'm doing it out of a sense of obligation. Avidna yomat aval rabbanan. I'll make a party. I'll make a celebration. Meaning a seudat mitzvah. It will be a celebration that's a mitzvah to attend. So what does that mean? So the same halacha, in other words, the later commentaries wrote based upon this, a bar mitzvah is obviously a sudat mitzvah. Why? Because if somebody becomes a bar mitzvah, what happened to them? Yesterday, when they did the mitzvah, they weren't obligated. The parents were obligated to teach them, but they weren't obligated because they didn't have any, the responsibility. They weren't mature enough to be obligated. Now, today, you became 13 if you're a boy, you became 12 if you're a girl. You now are obligated in the mitzvot. It's a simcha. Think about all the reward you're getting for doing the mitzvot now. It's a big deal. What does he say? Avidne yomat taval rabbanan. So this is actually the source that they got the concept of bar mitzvah from. This piece of the Talmud is where they derived the idea of a bar mitzvah, that you see that being obligated in the mitzvot is a reason to celebrate. Okay?
And
now, sure.
The timeline regarding bar and bat mitzvah, how does the bat mitzvah fall into... I mean, when I was a child, a girl, I could not have a bat mitzvah.
You mean like an event?
Yes.
Yeah, so we're going to get to that. So far, okay, you're right.
I learned, but I didn't do
But you didn't have a ceremony. Okay, so we're going to get to that.
I think we should have.
We're going to get to that. Yeah. Because you want to have a party. You want to have a party. That's no. So.
That's why the kids resist.
Yes, that's why they don't come back as soon as the bar mitzvah. Yeah, as soon as the bar mitzvah was there, they don't come back because they think that being not mitzvah also was better, so they stopped coming. Yeah. No, but that's actually just so you know, it's just an interesting thing to know that that's actually the original source from which the Achronim really, I mean, early maybe late Rishonim, early Achronim derived the concept of a bar mitzvah from this passage in the Talmud about the blind person, that being obligated in the mitzvah is a reason to celebrate. Now, fast forwarding a couple of millennia, okay, to the responsa of Rav Moshe Feinstein Z, who was a big posek and very revered. I mean, everybody studies his tshuvot even today. Both Ashkenazim and Sfaradim study them. In my course on Dayanut that I'm learning with the Sephardic rabbis, they quote his tshuvot all the time. He's considered somebody very, very significant in the history of halacha, and his piskei halacha have been extraordinarily influential, particularly in America, but really everywhere. And he has two tshuvot, two responsa on the issue of bat mitzvah. And again, I'm doing it in this order because it is chronological order, because Hakham Ovadiah is going to draw on these sources, including the statements of Rav Moshe Feinstein in his own tshuvot. So we need to know them first. So we know about the story of Rav Yosef. And now if you turn the back of that front page, you'll see is Igrot Moshe. Igrot Moshe is the collection of responsa from Rav Moshe Feinstein. And he says, Ma'alat Kevodo Yedidi Hanechbad Harav Hagaon Moreno Harav Baruch Aharon Popka Shlita. This was the she'la that was sent to him. Okay, this question was sent. What do we do with the bat mitzvah? And you could see the date. It was the year Yud Aleph Shvat Taf Shin Tet Zayin. What are we in now? Tav Shin. What are we in now? Ayin Dalet. Right. So you can figure out the. It's significant. That was. That's 16, and now we're in 74. So it's a while ago. Okay. So what is he? So he says. Now there were two questions asked in this tshuva. We don't need to see the second one about dishwasher, but nothing to do with the first one. So he asked him two questions. He wrote the answer. He says, "Bidvar inyan hachafetzim lahanhig eze seder v'simcha bebanot." Okay, so he says regarding those who would like to make some kind of, this was almost 60 years ago, this tshuva, remember. It says those who would like to make some kind of an order, some kind of a celebration for girls, kishenasu benot mitzvah, when they become benot mitzvah. Hine en la'asot ze bebet hakneset b'shum ofen. Af lo balayla. He says you may not do a bat mitzvah in the synagogue under any circumstances. Absolutely not.
All right.
That's what he said.
That's
why you didn't ask him.
Can you keep a refund?
Yeah. Okay. He says, why? Why? Ki bebet hakneset eno makom lasot divrei hareshut. Because you're choosing to do a bat mitzvah. It's divrei reshut. It's voluntary. How can you use a synagogue? He says, Av ben ivnu al tanai. Even if they built the bet knesset having in mind that they would do even things which were not necessarily the most holy things. You're not just allowed to do anything in the synagogue. Maybe they could build it outside. It was even controversial to have weddings in the Beit Knesset, because it's not. It's a personal celebration. It's not related to tefillah. So he said you shouldn't do it. V'hatzeremonia, that's a ceremony. Okay, we would call it a tekes in Hebrew, but this was before. This was very early in history. They didn't necessarily have all those words yet. Shel Bat Mitzvah. Uvadai rak divrei reshut, and not only does he say that, vehevel be'alma. That's pretty strong. So he says the ceremony of the Bat Mitzvah is at best, right? It's vadai divrei reshut. It's only optional, and it's hevel. It's nonsense. There's absolutely no room to allow it in the synagogue at all. Certainly with this, shehamakor ba me'areformer. The conservativer. Okay? Certainly not when it's coming from the reform and conservative. We don't want to be like them and imitate them. So says Rav Moshe. You want to do a personal simcha in your house? Rashai, I'm not going to tell him not to. Aval en ze shum inyan v'semech lachshiv ze dvar mitzvah usudat mitzvah. But there's no basis for considering it in any way, shape, or form. Any dvar mitzvah. It's not a sudat mitzvah. It has no significance whatsoever. Halachically, it's just your personal party. Enjoy the birthday party. That's it. That's what he's saying. Ki hu rak kisimcha shel yom huledet ba'alma. What is it? It's a birthday party. Yom huledet. Okay, this is what he's saying. Now listen to what he says. I actually like this part of the tshuva in particular. I like this part. He says, if I had the power, hayiti mevatel b'mdinatenu gam seder bar mitzvah. If I had the strength to do it, I would cancel all the bar mitzvah too. Why? Because he says, this is so interesting because you're talking about this was in the 50s, right? Or thereabouts. And he's saying things which are true today. And I've said the same thing. Gam b'seder bar mitzvah shel abanim sheki yadua lo hevi ze shum ish lekarvo laTorah v'lamitzvot, because the bar mitzvah has not brought one person closer to Torah and mitzvot. Meaning it's a waste of time. Ve'af lo et bar mitzvah af lo l'shah achat. Not even for 1 minute does it bring the bar mitzvah closer to the Torah. He says, instead it brings people to Chilul Shabbat because they come on Shabbat to the sin. They do all kinds of things. It's Chilul Shabbat that they shouldn't be doing. Al kol panim, ma shekvar unhag po vegam bazeh mimakor mitzvah kashe levatel. He says, but something that is already the established custom to have a bar mitzvah, and it comes from a source. There's a source for the bar mitzvah which we mentioned. It's from the Masechet Kiddushin. He says I can't really cancel it. Aval lechadesh zeh bebanot shel bekom belo makor mitzvah klal. But to innovate this, hold on, let's just read to the end first. But to innovate with girls where there's no mitzvah at all. He says, even though it's not prohibited, you shouldn't even do it at home. Why bring such a shtuyot? Why bring the shtuyot into your home? But to do it in the Beit Knesset, to do it in the synagogue, that's what we're learning the basis. We're learning the history of it. Okay, so he says to do it in the synagogue. Even at night when there's no tefillah going on, even sneak in the middle of the night in. Sammy will open the door for you. Asur, you can't do it. Okay, that's what it's saying. That's what Rav Moshe Zichron Livracha was saying. That was his position. Now, this is not the end of the story, because somebody asked him a question. Turn over to the next page. You will see it doesn't tell us the date on this teshuvah, but it's in the next volume of Igrot Moshe, so it was later, obviously. And I underlined some of the key parts, because we don't have to read the whole thing. But very interesting. He says, "Mashik kvod Torat Saharav mitkashe." So he says that you've asked the following question: Madua in mitzvah besudat bat mitzvah kishenasit bat yud bet shana kamo baben? Same question, right? Why is it not a mitzvah for a girl when she becomes 12 to have a bat mitzvah? Why is it only for a boy, not for a girl? And then he says, "De gam habata mitchayevet ata b'mitzvot." Doesn't the girl become obligated in mitzvot? And didn't we say that the whole basis for having a special celebration is because the girl became because the boy became obligated in mitzvot. So the girl is becoming obligated in mitzvot at the age of 12. So what's the difference? Why are you making a distinction? And then he himself says, "V'yesh lo sif lechazek kushya." I can make the difficulty even stronger, because the fact is that even if the boy doesn't give a drasha, we still have a celebration for him. And so you can't say because the girl doesn't give a speech, because back then they would never allow a girl to say a Dvar Torah in the synagogue. We're talking about the 50s, and they would never. So it would be unheard of in Orthodox synagogue for a girl to get up and speak. So he's saying, so you'll say it can't. That's not the deciding factor, because even if the boy doesn't have give a drasha, still you have a bar mitzvah. So why don't we have a celebration for the girls? Okay, and now I underlined it. He says, "Va'ayin beprima gadim." Prima gadim is an acharon that appears in the Shulchan Aruch. It says, "Sheikshal le'inyan birkat shepitarani, mai ta'amalo amrinan babat kishnaset b'yud bet shana." So he says, and you see that the prima gadim asked, why don't we say the blessing of Baruch Shepitarani? You know the blessing that we say when a boy becomes a bar mitzvah? Thank you, God, for freeing me from the punishment, right? So he says, but notice, he asked, why don't we say that for a girl? V'lo hikshal ma she'ino sin suda af shetama suda mishum de gadol mitzuveh ve'oseh shetam zeh hayeshno gam bebat v'hi kushya gdola. He says, it's a very good question. It's a very good question. In other words, the same reason why we celebrate the bar mitzvah applies to the bat mitzvah. The same reason we say Baruch Shepitarani for a bar mitzvah is because now he's obligated in mitzvot. The father is off the hook. So now, same for a daughter. So the question is raised in halacha. Why is it not universally accepted that it should be said for the daughter as well? That's a question, but nobody seems to be bothered by the fact that we don't have celebrations for bat mitzvah, even though it would appear that the same reason that obligates us in having a bar mitzvah, namely, that the boy is now obligated in mitzvot, should apply equally to the girl, that now she's mitzvah ve'osa. She's now commanded and fulfilling it out of a sense of obligation. There is absolutely no difference for the boy. Now he's obligated in tefillah. The girl's also obligated in tefillah. The boy was obligated. Is it obligated in Birkat Hamazon when he eats? The girl's obligated in Birkat Hamazon. In other words, all of the mitzvot that the girl does are now obligatory. So what's the difference between a boy and a girl? If we're celebrating the appearance of the obligation, the emergence of the obligation, it's the same. Yes.
When a girl becomes 12, there's a time between 12 and 12 and a half where her father can still nullify certain vows, right? Something it's not a full. I mean, she's fully obligated. But
it's only really for marital reasons that it's different. But in terms of mitzvot, she's 100% obligated. So it only affects in terms of certain marital rules about marrying her off.
But can I suggest here that there perhaps is a bigger obligation on the girl, because she is obligated when she marries and has children, etc., to keep everybody's footsteps in the way of the Torah and what we should do. It starts in the house, and etc., etc. And so many women were not
educated
to read and be.
You're right, and you know what? We're going to see that this issue in another tshuva is going to come up. The very point that you're making is going to come up, but not in this one. So he says, so how does he answer his own question? His question was, you're right, you got me. There's no difference between a boy and a girl when they're both becoming obligated at bar and bat mitzvah respectively. So why are we attaching greater significance to the boy? Why are we giving a bar mitzvah celebration and not a bat mitzvah? It says, Zo kushya gdola. It's a very, very good question. He answers an answer, which I'll bring it before you for your consideration, but it's a problematic answer. But let's see what he says. And remember that he's not shooting from the hip here. He's not just making this up as he goes along. He's bothered by a problem in the text as well, because he just noted that the achronim, the later authorities, meaning the rabbis after the 15th, 16th century or so, never raised this question before. Even though they raised the question with regard to the blessing of Baruch Shepitarani, they never said, why don't we have a bat mitzvah celebration? So he's saying, obviously they didn't think it was a problem that we didn't have it. So why? In other words, he's not just has his own theory and he's not going to let it go. He's really bothered by a difficulty in the sources. So he says, and we're going to see that also, well, I don't want to foreshadow too much. What's correct according to my humble opinion is, Mishum de'en nikar chiluk babat de ma'aseh. He says the thing is that when it comes to a girl, you don't immediately see a difference in the girl when she becomes a bat mitzvah. Velo dameh laben shenikar tuva. It's not like a boy, where it's very obvious. Sheme'ata mitzarfin oto l'chol davar sheba'e minyan. As soon as the boy becomes a bar mitzvah, he starts counting in the minyan. Asara, minyan shlosha, the minyan of 3 for Birkat HaMazon. Ve'al yidiyah be'alma, keshelo nikar le'ma'aseh en osin seuda v'simcha. He says, and something which is not discernible. In other words, the girl became 12, and now what? Can she be the chazanit? Not an Orthodox synagogue. Right? Can she count in the minyan? No. Does she put on tefillin? No. Count in the zimun? No. So then what changed? So he's saying there's nothing obvious, outwardly obvious, in a girl, certainly not in an Orthodox setting, which is the only one that he's going to be concerned with, that you could see that she became a bat mitzvah, so what are we celebrating? He says, Av shebe'etzem yesh bazeh ota simcha mamash. So there, he backpedals a little bit. He says, even though really it's the same exact simcha, she is now mitzvah ve'osa, she's now fulfilling mitzvot out of a sense of obligation, not just out of her own personal feelings. Umasha amar Rav Yosef, like Rav Yosef said, here it's bibava kama. Okay, that's not Kiddushin. We quoted the one from Kiddushin. Deman damar li en alachag Rabbi Yehuda avina yomat avad Rabbanan. Shemizeu makor lasot seuda bebar mitzvah. Right? He says that this whole idea of making a bar mitzvah celebration is based on Rav Yosef, who said, I want you to prove to me that I'm obligated in the mitzvot so I can celebrate for being obligated. He says, what about him? He says, tzarich lomar de gamken hu nikar. You would have to say that there's also going to be something really special and nikar. So what's the problem? So Rav Moshe gets himself into a problem here. What's the problem? He's making the chiluk. He wants to say that why is it that there's a difference between bar mitzvah and bat mitzvah? Because of the bar mitzvah, you could see he puts on tefillin, he counts in the minyan. Were we saying that a blind person didn't count in a minyan? Nobody was saying that. We never said that he couldn't do all of those mitzvot. So really, Rav Yosef is obviously keeping all of the mitzvot up till now. He just wants to think that he's obligated in the mitzvot. He was keeping them anyway. And he was counting in minyanim. So is there any big difference? So according to this logic, that only if there's a really obvious difference between before being obligated and after being obligated do we have a celebration, where's the big fireworks with Rav Yosef that we can now see? Right? That's the question. So he says, so he has to deal with that. So he says, maybe he didn't count in the minyan. He said, but that's difficult to say. But he said the reason is that since he was an Adam Gadol, since he was a very important person, they would give him to lead the tefillah, they would give him to lead the Birkat HaMazon, they would lead the Haggadah Pesach. So true, personally, it wouldn't make a difference, but it would be very obvious to everyone else because now he was able to lead. Now that's a little bit of a forced. So basically it's saying that only his being obligated warrants a celebration, but anybody else who's just a regular person, it wouldn't warrant a celebration. Okay? What? Yeah, it's a little forced. So what comes out in the end is, so Rav Moshe though sticks with this distinction. He says the distinction is, for boys, there's an obvious change in their communal role and in their outward behavior when they become a bar mitzvah. For girls, there isn't. And that's what he leaves it with. That's why he says, therefore, a bat mitzvah is prohibited. You shouldn't even do it in your house, but if you must, don't invite me. He doesn't say that, but that's, he's saying, don't have it in the synagogue.
And I would say, Kal v'chomer, isn't it much more so when the girl is not shown to be a leading part of the community and do what the men do, but she is fulfilling her obligation to learn, to know, to go to shul, to keep up.
But he's saying, since I don't see any big fireworks that I can identify, I can't count her in the minyan now, why should we have a celebration? What am I celebrating?
That's mean-spirited.
I'm just telling it like it is. I can't. He's not here to defend himself. He was trying to deal with a problem. He wasn't coming from his own. Actually, in many tshuvot, Rav Moshe Feinstein was very sympathetic to women's issues and things like that, and he has many permissive tshuvot on women's issues as well. He wasn't anti-women, but he's trying to deal with a fundamental textual problem, which is why did none of these rabbis ever raise the issue that there's no bat mitzvah celebration customary in our lands, but there is a bar mitzvah. And so he says there must be a difference, and this must be the difference. So that's where, so he is forced into his position, and he comes up with what we might consider a little bit of a stretch in terms of the logic, because why should it really, if the real simcha is being obligated, why should it matter whether the obligation is discernible to others? But let's leave that and say that's what he had to say. Now, we're going to come to, yes?
One factor. There's two aspects of this. One is an actual ceremony, and the second is a party celebrating the ceremony.
Right. So he says the ceremony is just made up, and the party is really where the mitzvah is. For a bar mitzvah, right? If a boy becomes 13, he doesn't really have, we require them to do things because we want to educate them. But really, even if the boy didn't do anything, it's still a bar mitzvah. He's still supposed to have a sudat mitzvah, because he's now obligated in the mitzvah. Maybe he's not going to read the Torah. Maybe he's not going to do anything.
I was never told that.
Of course they didn't tell you that. Because if they tell you can't have the party, if they told you can have the party without doing any work, would you have done it? Of course not. It was the incentive. Yes.
Now that you know that position, what is your stand?
Well, let's see the next step, okay? Okay, next step. So now we're going to come to Hakham Ovadiah, Zichrono Livracha. And this is from, first of all, his tshuvot. Really, the main tshuva is this one, which is Yechaveh Da'at. Yechaveh Da'at is a compilation of the tshuvot that were written based upon the radio program that he used to have in Israel, where people would call in. I spoke about it in the Hesped. People would call in and ask him questions, and off the top of his head, he would rattle off all of these sources, and they would make the thing. So he was very impressive. But Yechaveh Da'at is the transcription of these answers that he would give, and it's in a book of responsa. It's actually his most accessible responsa, because again, it was a radio program, so of course it's going to be accessible to the average person who's listening. And you can also see, if you know Hebrew, that he writes in a modern Hebrew. So Rav Moshe writes in a rabbinic idiom, what we call rabbinic idiom, a Talmudic kind of slang, whereas Hakham Ovadiah wrote in modern Hebrew. And you only see the rabbinic idiom when he's talking shop, but otherwise he's speaking Hebrew. So what was the she'elah? Na'ara she'egia legil bat mitzvah, a young woman who reaches the age of bat mitzvah, shemal'ula 12 shana v'yom echad, that she's completed 12 years and a day, which by the way is your birthday. Many people think they have to wait till the next day. That's not true. You're 12 years when you reach, on your birthday, that's the 12th year and the day. The new day is of the new year. Ha'im lefi ha'alacha yesh makom laruch la mesiba hagigit u'seuda. Is there any basis according to halacha to make for her a party, a mesiba hagigit, a festive party, and a seuda, a meal? O en lasot ken ela lanar shegel gil bar mitzvah shomeniach tefillin behigyod mitzvot. So he says, or should you only make a party for a bar mitzvah because he puts on tefillin? That's the question. So teshuvah, what's the answer? By Masechet Kiddushin, so he quotes first of all what we already read. We can skip this quoted part because we already saw it. But you'll notice what does Hakham Ovadiah do that really distinguishes him from Rav Moshe right away. You can see that he wants this to be accessible to any reader. So he starts out by saying, "B'Masechet, what's the basic source?" Rav Moshe Feinstein assumes you already know it. In passing, he says, oh yeah, and the thing about the statement of Rav Yosef means this. He doesn't tell you what the statement of Rav Yosef is. It says v'chule, it says etc. when he quotes it. He assumes you know it already, because he was writing his tshuvot, he was writing his responsa to other rabbis who knew the sources already. He didn't have to tell them. Hakham Ovadiah wrote for everybody. So when he writes, he starts out with the basics. B'Masechet Kiddushin, there's the story about Rav Yosef, he says that. And not only does he quote it, look, in brackets, if you count down where it says Teshuvah 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 lines, in brackets he translates it into Hebrew. Because the Gemara is written in Aramaic. Perush, Rav Yosef Ayasagina or Suma. He was a blind person. Ve'amar mitchila iti omer shim yomru li chachamim shalachak Rabbi Yehuda. He translates it into Hebrew. So anybody who knows Hebrew can read that. Now we already read it, so I'm not going to read it to you again. But the point is that he translates it into modern Hebrew, so anybody can understand it. And he takes almost this entire paragraph up till here to give you the basic source, first in the original and then rendered into Hebrew. Okay, so he's building it up from the bottom, from the ground up. And now he says, after those brackets, if you can find the end, Umikan lamad dagaon Rabbi Shlomo Luria Hamarshal Biam Shel Shlomo, and this is where the Maharshal, who was an early Acharon, who lived at the time of the Ramah, who writes the glosses in the Shulchan Aruch and had many tshuvot that they exchanged between the two of them, and is actually a major figure in Ashkenazic halacha, major posek from the 16th century Ashkenazic halacha, plays a big part in the evolution of halacha. B'yam shel Shlomo shesudat v'chagigat bar mitzvah lenar shemal'u lo 13 shana v'yom echad en lecha sudat mitzvah gdola mizo. He said there's no greater sudat mitzvah than this, becoming obligated in mitzvot. You can't have anything better. It's a wonderful thing. And so therefore what? That you're thanking God that He gave you the privilege of being obligated in mitzvot. Because somebody who's obligated and fulfills the mitzvot is greater than somebody who is not obligated. Even on the news that even just to find out that he was obligated in the mitzvot, Rav Yosef was going to make a party for all the rabbis. So much more so for a young man who becomes obligated in mitzvot in practice. These are the words of Rabbi Shlomo Iluria. As we turn to the next page, that a person should make a party on the day that his son enters the mitzvot. He would quote all these sources, by heart, by the way. But it doesn't matter. The point is, what does he do that's unique? First of all, in his style, he gives you all the background. Okay? He gives you the basic sources and all the necessary background to understand. He doesn't presume that he presumes that you speak Hebrew, that you understand Hebrew. But he doesn't presume, because he's addressing an Israeli audience, and all Jews should understand, and at least understand Hebrew, if not speak it. So he presumes that, but other than that, he presumes nothing about your background. He starts you with the basic Gemara, he translates it, he gives you the original source, the Maharshal. The Rav Moshe mentioned these in 2 words in passing, that you would know them already. The reader would know them already. So what is his first step? According to this, it should seem שגם לנערה שמלאו לה 12 שנה ויום אחד מחייבת בכל המצוות שהאישה חייבת בהן, הרי נעשית מצווה ועושה באותן המצוות, וראוי לחוג את כניסתה למצוות בסעודת תודה ושמחה. It stands to reason, according to this, that a girl should similarly, when she reaches the age of majority and is now obligated in mitzvot, to have a party. What's the difference? Because when it comes to obligation, they might be obligated in different mitzvot, but essentially it's the same thing. Okay? And so that's what he says. Now notice, there is what we would call an implicit smack. So the tshuva that we read before here. See if you can tell what it is. Who's the Gaon Rabbi Yosef Chaim Bavel? The Ben Ish Chai, right? Besever Ben Ish Chai, who was, by the way, the premier Middle Eastern Sephardic authority in Halacha before Hakham Ovadiah came, and a big part of his revolution was breaking away from him. Okay? That even though it's not the custom to make a meal for a girl when she becomes a bat mitzvah, okay, mikol makom ra'ui shetilbash b'gdei Shabbat te'asmecha b'ota yom al shezachta leikanes la'olam mitzvot. Ad kan. So the Ben Ish Chai says, even though it's not the custom to do it, she should dress in beautiful dress that day. She should be happy that day. She should have a simcha in her heart that day. In other words, what does that kind of show you? It isn't true that what? That nobody ever mentioned the concept of a bat mitzvah before, is it? Okay? So Rav Moshe, writing in the 1950s, said no Achron ever mentioned any concept of a bat mitzvah. They never raised the issue of a bat mitzvah. It's not true. It's just that he didn't know the Sephardic Sifrei Halacha. So he didn't know the Ben Ish Chai. The Ben Ish Chai mentions it. So now what does Hakham Ovadiah do with this? V'nir'a midvarav. And it seems from this, she'im noagim lasod la mesiba v'suda k'mo shosim lanar bar mitzvah v'agel mitzvot hadavar ro'ui v'hagon. What is the clear implication from Ben Ish Chai? He's apologizing. He's saying, even though we don't have the custom, meaning it wouldn't be a bad custom. It would be a nice custom. We don't have it, but it would be nice. Meaning, in a place where you have the custom, hadavar ro'ui v'hagon. It's very appropriate. And he says, "V'nechshav l'seudat mitzvah." Exactly the opposite of what Rav Moshe said. That it was absolutely not only reshut, not only optional, but hevel v'shtut. It was nothing. He's saying it's a seudat mitzvah. He says, of course, it should be modest and all that. Of course, it goes with it. Okay. So then, if you skip down, he says, "Nir'ah shesudat mitzvah." So he quotes other sources. Okay. Again, he quotes v'chein katav Rabbi Avraham Musafia. Sounds like an Ashkenazi? No way.
No.
Right? So these are Sephardic Chachamim that, of course, Rav Moshe, he didn't know them. He wasn't aware of them. He also writes, Shemisho seseuda biyom shenechnesa bito b'chiyuva mitzvot. That anybody who makes a party for their daughter, shemal'ula shneim shana v'yom echad, nir'ah shesudat mitzvahi. Anybody who makes a bat mitzvah celebration, it's a sudat mitzvah. It's considered a mitzvah. What's the difference between the two? This is what they did in France. Okay, it's a proper custom to do the same for boys and girls. And look how far Hakham Ovadiah goes. What's the difference if it's a sudat mitzvah or not? You're allowed to do it. What's the difference? He says, if you get invited, you have to go. Okay? In other words, but this is only if the Suda is on the day she turns bat mitzvah. Or the day he turns bar mitzvah. That's when it's... If they decide he's 13 and a half, they're going to have a party. No. The only time it's a Sudat mitzvah is when it's on that day that he actually is feeling the simcha, that he became obligated in the mitzvot. But the point is that he's saying it's the same thing, and it's even, you're not allowed if they invite you to say no. Like a Brit Milah, you're not allowed to say no. He says you're not allowed to say no. If they invite you to a party 5 days later, you don't have to go. But if it's on the day that it's really Sudat Mitzvah, you must go. You can't say no.
What about family that is not religious and they just do the party?
Well, that's always a question of, it's a good question. I mean, they're still, according to this, they're still, if they're recognizing that concept that now the person is obligated for their Judaism, so there's something there. There's something there. So now he's going to deal.
Very bad for the lady,
Oh, don't feel bad.
She wants to have a party. We Now let's take a look now.
I think you should cover it to Sephardic.
Now,
Response every morning hummus.
no, she doesn't. Hakham Ovadiah now, listen. Yeah, she's half and half already. Hakham Ovadiah is going to now take up Rav Moshe directly. Because he knew all of Igrot Moshe and everything else too. Okay? He knew everything. אמנם הגאון רבי משה פיינשטיין בשאלות ותשובות איגרות משה נשאל בזה וכתב שאין שום סמך ויסוד לחשוב לסדת מצווה מה שעושים חגיגה ומסיבה לנערת בת מצווה ואין זה אלא כששמחת יום הולדת בלבד. That he said it's nothing but a birthday party, right? That's what Rav Moshe Feinstein said. He says ודבריו תמוהים. These are shocking words. How could this be that he said such a thing? שהרי אותו הטעם שכתב המהרש"ל ביום של שלמה הנ"ל לגבי סעודת בר מצווה. The same reasoning given for a Sudat Bar Mitzvah applies equally here. Sheikh Gam Legabe Sudat Narat Bat Mitzvah. It's the same reasoning. So now he goes to the second Shuvah of Rav Moshe. What was the second Shuvah? Where he makes the distinction between where it's clearly manifest and where it's not clearly manifest. He says, that he brings one gadol, one rabbi who said to him, what kind of reasoning is this? Why is there a difference between bar and bat mitzvah? And what did he answer? V'katav leyashev, to resolve it, he said, she'en zeh domeh ledin bar mitzvah shesham hadavar nikar me'od, she'egia lemitzvot, she'arbikan l'laban mitzarfin oto leminyan. Chol davar shebektusha, he said, because it's very obvious. When a boy becomes bar mitzvah, he counts in the minyan, etc. Aval nara, shelo nikar ba'adavar lema'aseh. There's no real clear distinction for the girl. So therefore, Ella Yediah Bilvad, we know she'egia mitzvot. Now she's obligated. But what's the change? Lachen en lasod b'shvil sudat v'simcha. Af al b'shal etem adavar she'egia mitzvot sheyechet ota simcha mamash. So he quotes him. In other words, he's quoting him. That basically said, true, the simcha is the same, but at the end of the day, it's not nikar. It's not manifest. And if we turn over, he says, ve'etzel Rav Yosef haya davar nikar. שמצד גדלותו היו נותנים לו לברך או להוציא אחרים מידי חובתם עד כאן תורת דתו. So he says that Rav Yosef, why did he celebrate? Because now he'd be able to lead the prayers and it would be very manifest that he was obligated. Yeah, he was keeping all the mitzvot before, but he wasn't allowed to lead. So he quotes Rav Moshe respectfully, he quotes him, and then he says, Ve'en dvarav machavarim la'alacha. These words are not clear for halacha, meaning they don't fit with the halacha. These are not correct. That's a nice way of saying they're not correct. They're not halachically coherent, you could say. Machavarim la'alacha means they're not halachically coherent. Why? Because from where do we come up with these distinctions that have no basis? He's accusing him of shooting from the hip, basically. You're just making up any distinction that works. But that's not the way we work. The essence is when you become obligated in mitzvot. It doesn't matter if it's distinct or not, if it's distinguishable or not. He says, therefore, our conclusion is correct. That a girl should have, not only is allowed to have, but should have a sudat bat mitzvah, just like a boy has a bar mitzvah, because making up distinctions between boys and girls that don't have any halachic basis, we're not in the business of doing that. So we're not going to buy, well, it's manifest, it's obvious, it's not obvious. It's about the joy. It's not about obvious. So we're gonna put that aside. He says, "V'chen katav hagaon Rabbi Ovadia Yosef בשאלות תשובות ישכיל עבדי שבמקום שנהגו לעשות סעודה ושמחה גם לנערה ביום שנכנסה לעול מצוות ודאי שדבר ראוי והגון." So again, another Sephardic authority who writes that of course in a place where they have a custom of having a bat mitzvah they should do it, and he says just like we said in the Ben Ish Chai before, right? So that the Ben Ish Chai said it's not our custom here in Baghdad, but it's not a bad custom. Now that's Adkan, I would say. Up till now, we've seen the halachic discussion. And the halachic conclusion is, it's an obligation to do a bat mitzvah seudah according to Hakham Ovadiah. Not only is it not prohibited, not only is it not voluntary, it's an obligation. But now he shifts gears. And this is really remarkable. Because if you look at Rav Moshe's tshuva, there was a halachic component and there was a sociological component, right? The halachic component is, well, there's no basis for this, and none of the Ashkenazic Achronim mention this, and why don't they mention it? Oh, obviously because it's not good, and because they weren't bothered by the fact that there's a distinction between boys and girls. Nobody ever raised the question, why don't we have a bat mitzvah celebration? But he mentioned, what is the source of it? Reform and conservative, right? That's the sociological aspect of it. He says, and kal v'chomer, we don't want to do something that's done by the Reform and Conservative. That's what he said. Now look at Rav Ovadiah's, how does he sociologically approach this? Look how different it is. U'be'emet shemniyat chagigot lebnot mitzvah, holding back parties for the benot mitzvah, notenet yad leposh'im lekatreg al chachmei Yisrael. This empowers the sinners to criticize or to attack the rabbis. They're depriving the daughters of Israel. Look at how they're mistreating them. Discrimination, God forbid. Can you believe that this is coming from somebody from Baghdad? Okay, a Middle Easterner is concerned about discrimination between men and women. Okay, and Rav Moshe, a Westerner living in New York, didn't care about that.
But it's not enough because they lived in different environments. environments. Like
Right.
in Israel, the Reform and Conservative are like this big.
I know there's nobody there, right?
Yeah.
No, it's not an issue there. It's not an issue there. No, you're right.
So you're not afraid
But
of
the Chilonim are an issue, so he was saying the secular are going to say, look at these Orthodox, they discriminate against women, and it's terrible.
Yeah.
Right? But now it's more lemasa here. What he's saying is more lemasa here, because it's too late to worry about the conservative reform. It's, it's already a big force in American culture. It's not something that's going to go away. But we should be concerned that people say, hey, look at the Orthodox. They're so close-minded. They're so discriminatory. That's what he's saying is very applicable to today, to the Orthodox community of today.
Weren't they both writing for their time?
For their constituencies, yeah. But I just think it's fascinating. His approach is more what we would say is more more modern. It's more modern because it addresses contemporary concerns more.
I have
Okay.
I have a problem with
Okay.
this way of... I'm sorry.
Yes, what was the problem?
The reason is he's becoming a reactionary. He's saying just because I do not...
Well, he didn't say that. That's what I'm saying. He didn't say just because. In other words, first he said it's an obligation already. And he said not only is it already an obligation, he said because just like a boy when he becomes obligated in mitzvot has to, a girl should have to. There's absolutely no difference. And he says, and even more so, we should be concerned to make clear. In other words, he's saying we should make it clear that we do it equally. It's not just that we should do it, but we should make it clear. Why? Because we don't want to have the criticism that we discriminate and that we're sexist, basically. Yes?
What year was
I don't know what year this was written, actually. I'm not sure.
what general department? Was it the 50s too, or was it...
Probably a little bit later. Probably like maybe 60s, 70s, something like that, I would guess. I'm not exactly sure. Not too far off.
Irrelevant since he's relying on acronym.
Right, he's relying on sources older than either of them, but in terms of the social concerns, you're saying, it probably was a decade or two later than the previous two
He was
books.
also relying on sources.
Yeah, he also has sources much older than himself.
The other didn't.
Right, but the other didn't have. Now what's very interesting is he quotes an Ashkenazi source. Rav Weinberg, from, we're talking about the the first half of the 20th century Ashkenazi source. And it's amazing because Rav Moshe did not quote this either. Maybe he didn't have it available to him. Rav Weinberg was from, I think his son started Eish Torah. I think. They're related. I'm not exactly sure about the Yichus, but there's a connection. But no, he was before that. He was before that. V'chen matzat lagaon Rabbi Yehiel Yaakov Weinberg. B'shelot Shvat Srid De'esh. He lived through the Holocaust. He had Srid De'esh. He lived through World War II. She'achar sherich hirchiv kiyad Hashem atova alav lochiach. So he said after he went into this whole issue of Bat Mitzvah, he proved sherotzim lasot chagiga umsiba lenarat Bat Mitzvah in bezakol chashash isur mishum v'chukotem lo telechu. He said first of all there's no concern about imitating the nations of the world by having a Bat Mitzvah, which was one of the concerns people raised. Oh, it's not a Jewish custom. Where are you getting it from? Oh, because of confirmation, because of the church. I don't know what they thought. Now look where I underlined v'siyem. She'o'il v'chavanat rotzim lanhig hagigat bat mitzvah l'shem chizuk v'idur chinuchi labat she'egia lamitzvot shapir dam l'hanhig ken. This is sort of to your point, okay? The purpose of doing chagigat bat mitzvah is to encourage the education of the girls. Right. To reinforce it. Now he gives a very interesting, again, sociological point, but interesting nonetheless. He says, why did the people arguing against this? So now he addresses what Rav Moshe said. Why didn't they ever have this before? There's a simple reason. So this is not a good argument. Why not? They didn't educate girls in the old days. That's true. Why not? Because the religion, everybody followed the religion. They learned it from the house. They didn't need to go to school. So I'm sorry, I skipped the part. There was holiness of Judaism everywhere. And purity. Or B'Bait Yisrael, the girls who grew up in a Jewish house. So shafu lekirbam ruach dat virat Hashem. They absorbed, so to speak. They took into themselves this, the spirit. Okay, gam be'efes maaseh, even with nothing. They didn't need a formal education. Aval achshav, but nowadays shabavonot harabim nishtanu adorot shinui atzum. Now we're talking about a totally different generation. And he's talking about, he's saying this 60-something years ago, he's saying this, okay? והשפעת הרחוב הורסת ועוקרת כל זיק של יהדות מלבבות נערות ישראל. And the influence of the street is destroying, tearing apart, uprooting the Jewish spark. Okay? מוטל עלינו לרכז כל כוחותינו בחינוך הבנות. We have to focus all of our energy specifically on educating the girls. Okay? ולאשורנו כבר עמדו גדולי ישראל בדור הקודם על כך ותקנו מוסדות חינוך של תורה ודת לבנות ישראל והקמת רשת גדולה ומקיפה של בית הספר בית יעקב לבנות. היא הפגנה גדולה ונהדרה ביותר של חינוך הבנות של עם ישראל בדורנו. So he says the creation of Beit Yaakov movement for the Ashkenazic education of the girls. Okay? This is a big demonstration, Hafgana. It's a demonstration of the importance that the Gedolim realized. They never had schools for girls before. But starting at the end of the 19th century, they started to do this because they realized that it wasn't the same. The older generations, it wasn't the same. And he says, Vishurat higayon hayashar, v'chovat ha'ikaron pedagogi. Okay? He says, the line of logic here, straight logic, and the obligation of proper pedagogy, in other words, proper education is mechayevet kimat. It obligates us even gam lachog gam labat et yom agata lemitzvot. ואילו ההפליה הזאת שעושים בין הבנים לבנות פוגעת קשות ברגש אנושי של הבת. He says not only do we have to be concerned pedagogically, in other words, in terms of the education of the girls, if we tell them they're not important, if we don't encourage them, if we don't reinforce, if they don't have a bat mitzvah, they're going to say, what's the point? More than that. He says, think about that this discrimination that we're doing between the boys and the girls, pogat kashot b'regesh enoshi, it's going to hurt the human feelings. In other words, it's going to attack the humanity of this girl and make her feel less. Okay, the girl is going to be hurt. What?
Of everyone.
Of everybody, but especially of the girl who's the victim of the discrimination. So he is coming at it. In other words, you could say Hakham Ovadiah doesn't really need this. He was done on the previous page, right? Because he already proved that as far as I'm concerned, it's a mitzvah. It's an obligation. No, it doesn't matter. You like it, you don't like it. It doesn't matter to me. You should do it anyway. But now he's bringing the sociological. First, we don't want to be accused of discrimination. And look, even an Ashkenazi posek, Rav Weinberg, who was pretty progressive, to be fair. I mean, he was a progressive. He would be considered a modern. He's sort of like a modern Orthodox posek, rather than a Haredi posek. If you wanted to put him in a category, he's somebody that was considered progressive for his time, and still today, many of his tshuvot are considered very progressive. Many of his responsa, even by today's standards, are pushing the envelope in terms of his leniency. But he's trying to show you that even an Ashkenazic posek who didn't come to the conclusion that it was an obligation to have a bat mitzvah for halachic reasons. Rav Weinberg, he did not, but he still said you should do it. Why? Because of the sociological, because of the educational benefit of having a bat mitzvah, because of the emotional and psychological toll that it's going to take on the girl, that you tell her that as a human being she's less. Okay, I'm not saying these words, I'm saying what he says here. Okay, he says you're going to pogat kashot, you're going to hurt her human feelings. In other words, you're attacking her humanity. You're saying she's less. That's what he says. Yes?
Just a question. How does he halachically counter Rabbi Moshe Feinstein's halachic argument that the male bar mitzvah has certain obligations
right
at the age of 13?
Well, how does Hakham Ovadiah?
Yeah. I missed that.
Okay, so he basically says that, listen, it doesn't, both boys and girls, when they reach their respective dates, the boy being 13, the girl being 12, they become obligated in all the mitzvot that they're obligated in. So girls have many mitzvot that they're obligated in. Once they reach bat mitzvah, they have to pray, they have to say birkat hamazon, they have to do all the mitzvot now.
He's putting on tefillin,
right,
counting for
a minyan.
and so on the same level as the mitzvot that women have to do.
Right, he's saying it doesn't make a difference. They're obligated in their respective mitzvot. You became a mitzvah ve'osa of your mitzvot. You became a mitzvah ve'osa of your mitzvot. What difference does it make that one guy's mitzvot, the guy's mitzvot are more visible, the girl's mitzvot are less visible? He says that's an accident. That's just an accident of history.
Yeah, but this has a lot of implications.
Yeah, he's saying it doesn't make any difference from right. Well, from the perspective of the girl feeling that now I'm responsible for all the mitzvot that apply to me, and the boy says I'm responsible for all the mitzvot that apply to me. It happens to be that the mitzvot that apply for the boy are somewhat more visible, right? But still, as in terms of being mitzvah ve'oseh or mitzvah ve'osa, they're the same.
But even in the traditional context, they're only more visible to the men.
No, but if you
well, no, let's say the girl was always saying Amidah before. Now, when she says Amidah, she's obligated to do it. Now, can you really see the difference? No. Now, the boy, though, he counts for that. We pull him in for the minyan. He puts on tefillin. There's more.
Muslim or men, they
Right.
see her in the, they see him in the Beit. They're never going to see her in the Beit Knesset.
But also, there is no outward mitzvah that she does that it's obvious that now she's about mitzvah. That was what Rav Moshe was arguing. Hakham Ovadiah says, but it's not about the outwardness. It's about your feeling of simcha that now you're obligated in the mitzvot you're doing, whatever those mitzvot are.
If you
That's it.
If you step back, they were both agreeing that the individual becomes obligated.
Right, they're both agreeing on that.
Moshe Feinstein was trying to justify why nothing was done, and therefore he found a reason for the difference.
Right.
So really, you don't have to say why did he overcome it, because Moshe Feinstein was wrong.
Right. He's arguing that. Well, I mean, I would say, I guess that Rav Moshe's logic, in other words, he's trying to justify why it wasn't done.
Correct.
by saying that the seudat mitzvah by its nature. I mean, we can't just throw him out in the as that. But I think that his logic is that the seudat mitzvah by its nature is a social phenomenon, and so therefore it goes by social criteria, not just by your individual personal feeling of happiness. And so therefore, since for the boy there was a socially recognizable change, there was a reason to celebrate, and for the girl there's no socially recognizable change because it's not discernible. Hakham Ovadiah is coming at it from a different perspective. He's saying it's not about socially recognizable; it's about your personal simcha. And the personal simcha factor is equal boy or girl. Okay? That's
the source of Bat Mitzvah.
That was what we said in Masechet Kiddushin. The idea that that he said, if I find out that I'm obligated in a mitzvah, I'm going to make a party. Because that was the basis.
No, but for the age of 13.
Oh, 13, because the Talmud talks about the age of 13 is obligated in mitzvah. That's a universal... right. Right, ben shlosh mele mitzvot, but it's many places in Shas assumed. Many places in Shas assumed. So you see that Rav Weinberg, though, he says something different than Rav Moshe. What was Rav Moshe saying? He was saying, why didn't they have bat mitzvah? Because it's not required and it's not even good. Rav Weinberg was saying, why didn't they not have bat mitzvah? It wasn't necessary. It wasn't necessary. We didn't have to educate girls back then, so it wasn't necessary. Now it's necessary. So that was his argument. So then he goes on to quote additional sources that there's a minhag like this, and he even goes so far as to mention, and he says, "V'nachon lomar divrei Torah v'shirot v'tishbachot la'Hashem yitbarach b'mesiba hagigit she'osim lebat mitzvah." V'az bevadai nechshevet l'seudat mitzvah. He says, even if somebody is still going to argue against me that it's not a seudat mitzvah, so say divrei Torah at the table, because we know that on Chanukah he brings on Chanukah the seudot that we have on Chanukah are not seudot mitzvah, because there's no mitzvah to have a seudah on Chanukah. There's no mitzvah to eat on Chanukah. So what do? We try to sing songs of praising God. We have divrei Torah, and then it becomes a seudat mitzvah. So he says, fine, do the same thing for a bat mitzvah if you have a problem. But then you see besikum. He has a sikum at the bottom, the summary. Haminhag shenoagim lasot mesiba hagigit useudat hodah v'simcha lebat mitzvah biyom milot la shetem esrei shana v'yom echad hu minhag tov v'hagun. The custom that they have to have a party for a girl when she becomes a bat mitzvah is a minhag tov v'hagun, a very good and proper one. V'tov sheyomru sham divrei Torah v'shirot v'tishbachot l'Hashem yitbarach. Of course, you would probably say that at every meal that you ever have in your life, but this is even better to say divrei Torah, praises of God. Ulam yesh lishmor b'kapdanut al klalei hatzniut. But it's important that it be a modest, appropriately modest, lefi dat Toratenu HaKdosha. Ukemo shenemar ivdu et Hashem b'simcha v'chilu bir'adah. b'mkom gila sham ter'ada. In the place that you celebrate, you should also have trembling, meaning to say that you should also be respectful. It should be with reverence. It shouldn't be a wild party out on the town, Bat Mitzvah.
Elvis Presley.
No. Elvis Presley could be tzanua. He just needs to get looser, a little bit looser clothes. So the
impression about Ovadia Yosef, it's tremendous. You can see the future for hundreds of years.
Yeah, he's very He has a very broad perspective. But I think if you wanted to put in simple terms, what is the machloket? If you want to not just reduce it to a matter of history, but want to understand that, I think that what we said before is really encapsulates the difference. That according to Rav Moshe Feinstein, he was looking at the Sudat, Bar Mitzvah, or Bat Mitzvah as a social phenomenon. So he said to be a communal celebration, there needs to be something nikar, something discernible. So therefore he didn't see that in the Bat Mitzvah. Whereas Hakham Ovadiah is saying it's not a social thing, it's really a personal thing. It's a personal thing. In other words, that I feel the simcha and I'm sharing it with you. So since it's a personal thing, there's no difference, he says, between the personal feeling of the Bar Mitzvah and the Bat Mitzvah. Now what I copied at the end, we don't necessarily have to go through it. I just wanted you to get a feel for it, okay? I wanted you to see it. Now, by a total, what would seem to be chance occurrence, mikra, accident, the responsa number in Yachaveh Dat and the responsa number in this tshuva is the same, 29. Very unusual by chance. Both about the Bat Mitzvah. Now, Yachaveh Da'at, remember, was written based on the radio program. Yabia Omer is like what we call the magnum opus of Hakham Ovadiah. It's the really extensive, where he has tshuvot that are pages and pages and pages of double-sided things like this. Okay? I mean, double-sided, and this is a small version of it. The real set is big. 10 volumes of hundreds of pages in each volume that look like this, okay? Full of sources. Now, this is really extensive, where he gets into the really difficult questions, the questions that he ruled on in the Batei Din, on Agunot, on Mamzerim, on all kinds of difficult kashrut questions, and the whole area of, the entire corpus of halakha he deals with. They came out with an index of Yabia, it's called Yabia Omer. Yechaveh Dat Yabia Omer from the same pasuk. So they had the index is this thick and this tall, okay, of the tshuvot, because there were I don't know how many, and not only did they index it according to topic, they indexed also according to Shulchan Aruch. So if you're studying a part of Shulchan Aruch, you want to find anything he said about it. And they made a summary of each teshuvah in there. It's unbelievable the work that they did in this volume. But it's the volume this thick and this tall. I mean, it's huge. It's the size of one of the volumes of the set. Even bigger, maybe. Even bigger than one of the volumes of the set, I think. Because it's really thick. So anyway, this is Yabia Omer. I just wanted you to see it. So he says Nishalti Odot Mashinagu Mikarov. Now this is much later. This is from volume Vav of Yabia Omer. I don't know the exact years that these were published, but it was later in his life. So he talks about Nishalti Odot Mashinagu Mikarov Laroch Hagigat Bat Mitzvah. Actually, technically, Yechaveh Dat might have been published, after Yabia Omer was published, but the original answers, if I'm not mistaken, were given before. I could be wrong. I have to check on the chronology. But in Yabia Omer, he always gives a far more thorough treatment, and I just wanted you to see. He deals with two questions in this responsam. One is whether we should say Baruch shepetarani me'onsha shel zot for a girl, just like we say Baruch shepetarani me'onsho shel zeh for a boy. And then he goes in further into the teshuvah, all the way on the third page, where I underlined some stuff. Then he says in Ot Daled, in letter Daled, now let's go back to the Sheila Rishonah, if you can have a Bat Mitzvah. Okay, to the first question. So all of the other stuff was Baruch Shepetarani. Now what he does that's amazing is he goes to the Midrash that's the source of saying Baruch Shepetarani first. Where's the midrash that gives? Where do we get this idea that when a boy becomes a bar mitzvah, we say, "Thank you for freeing me from the punishment of this boy"? So he gives the midrash. He goes through the whole history of it in the sidurim of the geonim and what they had and what was their version and where did it come from and what was the reason. Is it for the father thanking God that he's not obligated for the son, or is it the father thanking God that the son won't suffer for his own for his own mistakes. In other words, the father is thanking God, right, for the sins of the father. So he goes through a whole discussion of that, and then he comes out, I'm summarizing, and obviously summarizing, as you could see, a lot of words and a lot of sources, because every line is a lot of sources. Basically, it comes out that the ikar, the real meaning is that the father is thanking God for releasing him from the responsibility of training the child, because now the child is responsible for his own mitzvot, and therefore it should apply equally to a boy and a girl. It should be Baruch shepitarani me'on shoshel zeh, Baruch shepitarani me'on shashel zot. And he said, and since we don't say Hashem's name anyway when we say the blessing, what difference does it really make if we say it? Because we don't say Hashem's name anyway, so why are we making such a big deal out of this whole discussion? That's essentially what he says. He says, yes, we should say it because the reason applies equally to boys and girls. And that's what I underlined on the very last page. He says that since a father is obligated to train his daughter in the mitzvot that apply to her, just like he's obligated to train his son in the mitzvot that apply to him. And when the boy reaches majority, he's released from the obligation of training him, because now the boy's on his own. Same with the girl when she reaches Bat Mitzvah. So there's the reason to say the blessing is the same in both cases. Therefore, we can say that the source is the midrash that says bino, that you only say it for your son, is lav dafka. It means your child. It's not being precise. It means any child. And therefore he says, and since we don't say the bracha with shemu malchut, we don't say the blessing with God's name anyway, we can be lenient, and we don't have to worry about those who might oppose it. We can do it anyway, and that's what we do here at Magen David. Now, the last thing with Bat Mitzvah, essentially he goes through the same discussion that we saw in Yechaveh Da'at, maybe with a little bit more bringing of a couple more sources, but essentially he brings a couple more sources that in Yechaveh Da'at he's trying to be very brief because it was for the radio show. Here he gives you some more sources, Rishonim, Achronim, that are relevant to the subject. He also brings what the Ben Ish Chai says about having birthday parties. How he said, it's a very nice minhag to have a birthday party.
I thought it was Christian.
No, he says the Ben Ish Chai says it's a very nice thing to have a birthday party, and that he himself thought it was a nice thing to have a birthday party. And even better, there were some people that instead of having a birthday party would have a party on the anniversary of their Brit Milah. When they really became a Jew, became a part of the covenant, and he said we don't do that in Baghdad, but it was a beautiful custom. So it's just a fascinating tshuva. Obviously, would require at least an hour to go through all of the material. Probably, if at least 30 minutes to go through the material. So we would save it for another time. But please feel free to keep the packets and reflect on what we learned tonight. Thank you for coming.